Welcome everyone to our podcast, The Future of B2B Digital Marketing. Today we are focusing on how to effectively use platforms like Facebook, Google, LinkedIn. We have an impressive panel with us, and we will start discussing your challenges in your B2B strategy and how to leverage the different platforms. So let's start with a quick round of introductions. James, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks for having me on. My name's James. I work with Abcam as a digital media specialist. Abcam's a biotechnology firm based in Cambridge, and I primarily work in platforms like LinkedIn, Google, and third-party trade publications.
I'm Luke Rose-Smith. I'm a paid media specialist at SureCloud, who are a GRC software provider in the cybersecurity space. And prior to that, I've been a digital performance director at a B2B marketing agency, specializing in creating and implementing multi-channel strategies. So this is a perfect topic for me.
Hi, so I'm Charles, Digital Marketing Manager for TalkTalk Business. I look after all of our online channels from paid social, PPC, SEO, display, programmatic, you name it. And I like to summarize my role as trying to get as much volume for as much value as possible. So volume in terms of sales and value in terms of lowest CPA and lowest.
And my name's Tom, and I'm the Chief Executive of Adzact, which is a B2B ad platform. But we're obviously a really new company founded in February of this year. So Joaquin and I are the marketing team. So we spend a lot of time staring at numbers of clicks and awareness, and 75% of the video watched. How many people? That's all their numbers still.
And I'm Joaquin Dominguez, and I'm head of marketing of Adzact, and we are hosting this podcast. So welcome everyone. As I told you before, we will start talking about your challenges. Okay, so James, you work in the life science space with a focus on research. So can you talk us about the specific challenges in targeting and reaching your niche audience in your sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to provide a little bit of context, Abcam obviously exists in the life sciences space. Primarily, we produce and sell antibodies and other research chemicals to help life scientists with their research. It means that our audience is simultaneously very broad, but also very narrow, because we're interested in a lot of touch points within the life sciences universe, whether that's universities, whether that's sort of little, biotech companies operating out of people's garages, all the way up to huge pharma organizations. This means we're talking to a really broad range of scientists. But obviously, at the same time, it's a relatively small, restricted field. So I would say the number one challenge that we face when our addressable universe is so small is getting our segmentation right and minimizing wastage. I'm sure this is stuff that we'll get onto, but this is one of the reasons that, for example, we make so much use of platforms like LinkedIn, platforms with robust targeting functionalities for these really narrow segments, because we find that if you use more traditional targeting methodologies, you can easily hit 10 million reach overnight, and realize that a lot of that must necessarily be wastage because of the size of the universe that we're addressing.
You mentioned LinkedIn, right? How important is LinkedIn in your strategy to outreach and raise awareness?
Yeah, it's relatively central. It has been historically. We are trying to diversify the media mix and make it a little bit less essential for reasons that will probably become apparent when we get to talking about seasonality. But I do find with LinkedIn that it's sort of the perfect fit for what we want to do in terms of the amount of employment information people very proactively share about themselves. I quite like it as an ad platform. It feels very transactional. Not to get into the sort of ethics of advertising, but I think it's interesting that there's a clear transaction taking place between users giving this information because specifically it helps LinkedIn function as a recruitment tool for surfacing their profiles. But then in exchange, it gives us an absolute wealth of data to form segmentation from. Like no other or very few other platforms can we go as granular as, we want people with these job titles and this amount of experience in these industries and these geolocations. So it's extremely powerful in that regard. but obviously being that it's auction based and being that they can charge an absolute premium for this kind of inventory, because they're basically the only ones with this kind of robust targeting, it means that you can potentially end up paying an awful lot for it.
Just to echo what James was saying there, I think the tricky thing is finding that balance, because I read somewhere earlier on today that only 50% of the LinkedIn audience is active. So yes, it's amazing for audiences, and we can really be narrow with our targeting, but there needs to be a balance of making sure that we're reaching the right people and also casting on that a bit further so that we can touch them multiple times, and not just LinkedIn, because they might not even open the LinkedIn app for a couple of weeks at a time. So I think that's the tricky bit with kind of B2B marketing, is trying to find platforms that have good audiences while not having lots of wastage.
I suppose you could, in theory, you could probably find who is active and then upload just their email addresses to LinkedIn and just target them. But I suppose it wouldn't really necessarily matter, because the people that are not active, in theory, won't get impressions. In theory, shouldn't be paying for those people.
Does anyone ever find that perhaps the LinkedIn targeting is too robust? So what I mean by, let's say, right, I think if you're in the life sciences or in the industry, right, and you are able to become very, very granular, then you end up with, let's say, an ad set of 10,000 or 50,000, and because that's so small, we try and throw in marketing on that, and then you factor down on, let's say, 10% response rate, and then you have to go through the funnel. What ends up actually being, let's say, an engaged audience, if you have such a niche targeted place. Has that ever happened to get negative results, as in it's too targeted?
That's a really interesting one, actually. I think sometimes you can almost leverage over targeting with LinkedIn because of its utility for example, ABM work. If I pull together a segment from job titles and industries and things like that, and it shook out to less than 10-20,000, I'd probably be quite concerned about that segment and the resource required to actually to run it versus the likely return. But if those 10,000 people are generated by, for example, uploading a list of key accounts and matching those to people with specific roles at those accounts, then I find that can potentially be quite beneficial, because while you'll only potentially get a few contacts from that, you might only get a few bites on the hook. The potential value, if they convert, is enormous. Yeah. So I think it really depends on what kind of KPI framework you're using for the LinkedIn work.
I think sometimes the audience that engages on LinkedIn is not the same as the audience that is going to buy from you. So what I mean is, you could, there are certain sorts of characteristics that mean someone's more likely to click on an ad, and in the consumer world, we had this investor called Halvarian in one of the companies founded some time ago. He was Google's chief economist, and he invented their ad auction system. And he always had this anecdote that there was a strong correlation between low academic achievement and likelihood to click on an ad, which is obviously quite a dangerous thing for Google to be saying. But anyway, I'm sure the same thing is not true in B2B world, but there will be some characteristics that mean someone's more likely to click on an ad. And that does not necessarily mean, it's not always exactly the same as them being likely to buy. I know it sounds weird, but to James's point, you might be really happy with a high frequency, like a high number of impressions against each unique person within a really well-targeted audience, even if they don't click, because they might convert through other means. I suppose that's what you mean, James.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, within reason, I think pushing for frequency is valuable for the segments that we work with. I also think it's just kind of a universal truth across platforms, at least for a scientist's audience, that the people who you advertise to are not necessarily the same people who are making the purchase. Obviously, create some challenges around attribution, but usually, a bench level scientist will see an ad, and then they will, become convinced by whatever process to purchase from an organization, and then they will take that to their, director of studies, their procurement person. So doing that kind of direct chain of attribution from purchase back to ad is virtually impossible. It's very stochastic. But yeah, absolutely. I do see the issue.
I don't necessarily think that a small audience is really a negative thing. All it means that is you have to update your content more regularly to kind of combat that frequency level, which can be a good thing, because it means that you're kind of refreshing your content regularly because you need to, rather than just kind of pushing out the same ad for 2-3 months at a time. Kind of forces you to rethink that.
It's also super easy now to create almost unlimited variations of your ads with like ChatGPT. So in theory, there should be no excuse for hitting the frequency cap.
That's right. And I'm interested to hear what's your opinion about LinkedIn targeting accounts or targeting people? Which one do you think is more effective, LinkedIn? Targeting accounts or people?
I think it depends on your objectives, really. Like James mentioned here about the buying committee. So there's especially in kind of in the GRC world and a lot of B2B markets, the buying committee is so large. So it's not just the chief information security officer that's going to be making that purchase or doing the research. There might be legal counsels that, or there might be a chief financial officer that needs to have an input or a procurement. So I think from an ABM perspective, it's always worth going for the account because you can hit a lot much more touch points. Whereas if you do contact, you're limiting yourself a little bit in terms of the exposure your brand gets. But yeah, it ultimately depends on what your objectives are.
My question was more related with the effectiveness of LinkedIn filters. When you filter at an account level, is it enough to target industries or growth of industry, those kind of filters? Or
there's way more detail on, like James was saying, skills of individual people, their experiences. It's like so many.
Narrow is ridiculous. I mean, like on Facebook, you have a little bit of information on people's interests, which is mostly culled from the pages that they've liked. Whereas with LinkedIn, because again, it's a recruitment tool, people share a huge amount of detail on their sort of professional skill. You can and together so many different criteria, like their skills, their fields of study, obviously industry, job title, job seniority, years of experience.
They're not going to share like an interest in amino acids on Facebook or like, but on LinkedIn they might, because they want to be they want to be hired for.
Yeah, particularly if it's one of their marketable skills. If they're like, oh, I do love flow cytometry. You're not going to say that on Instagram, but yeah.
Well, who knows? Probably is somebody.
Yeah. And what about the other platforms for a B2B purpose? What's your experience targeting accounts or people in your digital campaigns?
I think Facebook are trying to kind of scale that B2B space. They've recently introduced some targeting around size of companies, and also kind of decision makers, but ultimately it comes down to user generated information. Like LinkedIn has all that user generated information, but how often do you see someone that's put their job title on Facebook? So it is hard, and maybe that's where we then leverage lookalike audiences. I think Meta algorithm is a lot more powerful than LinkedIn in terms of matching those lookalike audiences. So that's probably where we can leverage that a lot more.
Yeah, but as you say, they're going to be doing it on consumer variables, like whether they like Lady Gaga and wherever they've been on holiday. And
we all like Lady Gaga, so that's a large audience.
I know, so that's a useless match.
Yeah, I mean, since they have such a huge mountain of data, I guess they can just sort of stir that to get extremely strong correlations out of what would appear on the surface level to be quite weak associations. I've never really tried Facebook as an account-based marketing tool. I think that'd be an interesting one. I have used Facebook for B2B in the past, though. It was for it was at a previous organization, and it was for it was targeting quite broad interest products, things like commercial waste management that like basically any business would need, which I found was quite efficient. You could optimize down the CPLs quite well there because it was so broad. Whereas with life science, it just comes back to the wastage problem for me on Facebook. It's okay for like brand launch, things like that, when you're buying lots of impressions for not very much money and the key goal is engagement, and a bit of wastage is okay. But for actual like anything around acquisition or driving actions, I'm hesitant at least.
How about you, Charles? You must have the problem of leakage from the consumer world because the brand is so strong. If you put up an ad with the TalkTalk logo, you're going to get a lot of clicks, but there must be, like James is saying, quite a lot. I mean, it's even worse than James because no one's necessarily going to click on an ad about antibodies unless they are in the know, but they might. I mean, we have a client like Just Eat for Business. They have a terrible problem because if they put a picture of a burger up and they say, do you want food in your office? They get like 1 billion leads and none of them are any good because they need people that are going to spend at least 500 meals a week. And so almost all of them get rejected unless they're like really. But you must have that problem in TalkTalk, I would guess.
Yeah, you're right. There is a lot of overlap between, let's say, the interest that we get if you've got advertising on Facebook. A lot of people, let's say, might engage with material, thinking that they're engaging with TalkTalk as opposed to the distinctive TalkTalk business. So that does work negatively in some aspects, but there's also, let's say, there's the positive leakage, because of the TalkTalk brand
Yeah.
being quite well known as a whole. We do benefit from that as well. I think so what we try and do as much as possible, I think like other people have mentioned on the call, is try and be as granular with our targeting as we can. So I'm very much a fan of custom CLV audience uploads, working with our CRM team to try and make sure that we're targeting the right people for the objective that we are trying to get. And I find that is that probably, let's say, more helpful than perhaps a audience built from Facebook targeting, but depending on what you're trying to do.
Just override it, can't you, and say, I know the people, here are their email addresses or whatever.
Exactly, yeah. So you just focus specifically on a set audience. For example, let's say we've got a product, so FTTP. So FTTP is only, let's say, eligible to people that can actually have FTTP within their area. So sorry for that's full fiber. So it's a full fiber product. So you wouldn't want to be targeting people that say that aren't full fiber like compatible. So when we do the targeting for that, we make sure that on Facebook, our campaigns are only targeted at full fiber enabled people based on the CLV audience that we upload, as opposed to anyone that could perhaps fall into a category within a certain area.
I'm interested with that tactic. How granular are your campaigns? Do you have like campaigns for a certain like location that has full fiber? Like it must be really segmented to get that granularity.
Yeah, so it depends on the product. So for full fiber, yes, we have what I'd say full postcode targeting. So looking at, say, what is the best areas to target the FTTP footprint within the UK, working with our CRM team. Basically, you just factor out any postcode that is not compatible, any postcode that doesn't have, let's say, the level of audience within that sector that we want to target. So we're going to move that out, and that actually helped us improve our results a lot more. But then it may be different for, let's say, with a different product. So what would be known as dedicated lease lines, because that is a countrywide availability. So you wouldn't need to do that for postcode targeting because anyone within the UK could get that. So it depends on what product we are trying to advertise for.
Well, sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah, I think it's always work. Targeting and trying to get better results is just the bane of our existence. I think that everyone can share that.
But also you have the potential of disappointing someone, I guess, who calls in wanting the full fiber product, and then you have to explain to them that we can't, unfortunately your street is not connected yet, and that could be disappointing to them. So I guess that's why it's important.
And Charles, we also talk about, I'm moving a little bit the conversation towards your challenges, because you talk about finding the balance between long-term brand building and short-term campaigns, maybe like the ones that you have described. How do you balance that?
With difficulty, I would say, because it's more the case of managing the internal stakeholders, because we work collaboratively with our sales department, but there's always that constant challenge of, understandably, there are pressures from the top and people want immediate sales results. So you want to be doing activity that drives immediate results, but then top of funnel activity, where that's brand building, but it doesn't drive immediate results, but it builds a pipeline that you need to drive results down the line. So it's a constant battle of a tug of war with what activity can you do to drive immediate results, and what activity can you do to make sure that in 6 months' time you still have an engaged audience to capitalize on results then, especially some of our products like dedicated lease line, where the actual sales journey is several months. So you have to make sure that you do build that pipeline in advance, or in 4 months, 5 months, everything is going to dry up. So that's the that's the internal stakeholder challenge. And personally, I'm very much a fan of the approach from Les Binet, who I think is head of effectiveness for Adzact DDB, of the long and short of it. So having, long-term brand building that is always, let's say, always on for the awareness approach. You have to build that in the background, and then having regular short bursts of sales-driven activity So that's the best practice that I would say is the holy grail of what you would do to get the best results. But then it may not actually work in reality. Example I always love to come to, I think, is John Lewis. The John Lewis, I think, are well known for their Christmas advertising. Right? When it's come to Christmas, everyone wants to go to buy John Lewis, and they rake in on the sales. But obviously, that just doesn't just happen in November or December. They've been building that brand for a very, very long time, and they capitalize that on certain periods. I think that's the kind of balance that you're always trying to find.
We had an interesting episode a couple of months ago about always on versus project based, and we had this guy from YouGov who said everyone thinks that YouGov is part of the government, and so every time we do ads, it just washes over their heads because they're like, oh, that's not a business, that's like the government. And so what they had to do is like concentrate all their resources in like a 6-week period, all their marketing budget over short, sharp bursts where they could saturate the people they wanted to target to change their opinion, which was probably pretty set about what YouGov was. We had Ericsson as well, which is the same thing. It was like everyone thinks we're 90s phones, and so we have to try and convince them that we are the future of 5G. And so we have to like completely saturate them, but over a really short period of time, because if we just do it generally, it never gets above the threshold of changing their minds.
Yeah, we also talk about the problems with attribution using always-on strategies. I don't know what's your take on that, Charles, or whoever else in the panel.
Very, very, very difficult. So obviously, the holy grail for attribution is if you have econometric modeling, but not everyone has the detail of that. So if you try and do, let's say, if you isolate what is a variable that's changed within a 6-month period, so okay, cool, we had this activity live for 6 months, and this happened. We didn't have it live for 6 months. But then, as I mentioned, let's say if you've got display or any top line activity live, right, and it doesn't lead to direct sales in the reporting, one, the business may not be that keen on having it live because you're not getting the results that they say, inverted commas. But then secondly, we know that marketing channels have an interrelated relationship. So you may have display activity live, which is then helping to drive PPC sales, or vice versa. May have PPC live that's helping to convert somewhere else. So you have to always try and look at not just the channels in isolation. If you want to do attribution, how are the channels or the activity, how they're correlating to performance across each other within the same time frame.
Yeah, I think attribution is probably every marketer's nightmare, because it is just so hard, especially in the last couple of years with Google and Apple revising cookies and changing cookie policies. I think it should have made everything so much harder to attribute, and there's only so much that HubSpot or a CRM can do. So it is tricky to attribute which channel has played a part in a certain lead, especially when we're talking about it's pretty easy for B2C, because what happens usually is if someone sees an ad, clicks on it and buys something, whereas B2B, because the sales cycles are so long, it's so hard to kind of look at what touch points played a part here, what touch points played in there. So I think moving forward, attribution is going to be quite a key thing for us B2B marketers to nail, really, because I think for especially my experiences, paid media strategies have kind of taken a lot more of influence in a business as a whole. So a couple of years ago, I think we would just run some campaigns, get some leads in, and that would be it. Whereas now I think we're taking a lot more influence in reporting to the board, having a bit of a say on what happens in the next 6 months, a year, in terms of content creation, in terms of our targeting, our strategies from sales and marketing. So I definitely think that's kind of the next 6 months to a year is key.
Yeah, in that episode we had someone saying regarding the LinkedIn strategy, I totally moved out of always on as a paid strategy on LinkedIn, and he left all the organic side as an always on strategy, and all the paid strategy just campaign focus, because of attribution, because of how hard it was with, and he was only talking about
that's so
one
rubbish,
platform.
isn't it? Like, to be forced to do things in short, sharp bursts so that you can, that's just rubbish. That's like, it's changing, because what that's not how you actually want to be talking to people necessarily, just to do it just so you can prove it. There is you can, if instead you start with a list of companies and you know exactly the companies you're going after, and then you upload that to LinkedIn, and then you filter down by the job titles from whatever, James, then you can see who actually buys. And then in theory, don't need to rely on clicks on LinkedIn, which, as we've said, you often don't result in sales, or sometimes the people that are getting impressions, like that's really valuable, but they don't immediately buy. You can look at a correlation between how many impressions this account got and how likely they were to become a customer from any source. I've seen that really be very persuasive to a CFO because you can show a confidence and a degree of confidence level and whatever.
Yeah, that kind of hybrid, slightly stochastic attribution model can be very valuable, and it definitely does, enable a little bit more mobility in running always on. I feel like also with the sort of smart hybrid attribution is something that's going to potentially be quite a good application for AI tools moving forwards. I mean, I know that this is already something that's in the pipeline, but yeah, I feel like with for example, the fact that now, with the cookie apocalypse taking place, we can often see that something like 50% of sessions get lost before they even get recorded into a platform like Google Analytics, very often, because if they're first-time visitors coming through paid sources, often they haven't sort of opted in to receive cookies by the time, that session would have been recorded. So there's a huge amount of drop-off there, but being able to extrapolate broader trends from that very incomplete data set, I feel like is probably quite a good application for this technology that's probably going to become much more front and center in years to come. Though, I've realized people have been talking about this since about 2017, 2018, and I'm yet to see a really sort of robust model yet, but we'll be interested to see where it goes.
All right. Look, you mentioned challenges in nurturing high-value leads. What strategies have you found effective in this area?
Yeah, I think we've already touched a little bit on this in terms of from Charles and James's kind of struggles and challenges. So I think the challenge that we have is our sales cycle is so long. It could be 6 months to a year. So from that first touch point 6 months ago, how do we then keep them top of the mind? How do we then basically nurture them through the funnel? What content do we create? And we've got quite a small team here in terms of marketing and sales, so it's quite easy for us to be able to engage sales and SDRs in what we're doing and the messaging we do. But I think for larger organizations, it's a lot harder to have that alignment. So I think it's really key trying to make sure that you have the same messaging, both that marketing are pushing out and also that SDRs are using. But yeah, that is the biggest challenge for us, is just making sure that we're keeping our brand top of the mind and trying to focus on their pain points and making sure that we are top of the mind, that when that 6 months or 8 months come around, that we're part of the decision process and we're considered, because 6 months is a long time. One click on Google Ads, 6 months time we've forgotten about. Whereas it's quite key to make sure that we leverage those multi-channel strategies. So we leverage, Meta, LinkedIn, Programmatic, even software review sites such as Capterra and G2.
Yep.
We need to make sure we've got a presence on them, because if someone comes around to the decision making and they see a competitor's ad and they click on that and they see their offering and that is different to us, then they're probably going to end up going with them and having a conversation rather than us. And we want to make sure that we're part of that conversation.
We were chatting to a lady from a video management company the other day, Monday, about MNTN, Mountain MNTN, which is like connected TV. And she was doing retargeting on connected TVs using MNTN, which is, I think it's a company owned by Ryan Reynolds, like Deadpool actor, which is completely weird. But anyway, you can owner of Wrexham Football Club, I believe someone said to me as well. Yeah. But yeah, so he owns it, or you've invested in this company, does all the marketing for it. But in theory, yeah, it's basically an ad platform, but you can upload a list of people and then you can retarget them using their connected TVs, and you can put various different criteria that she was using to correlate with. Obviously, it's a bit like the thing of, targeting whether they're going to buy antibodies based on whether they like Lady Gaga. Like, you do have to say they have to be in these areas, and it's a bit silly, but apparently she was saying it was working for her.
Programmatic is becoming a lot more powerful now. Like we use a platform called StackAdapt as a DSP, and they ingest B2B intent audiences. So like Bombora, that can be a game changer. Usually if you're using Google Display Network, you're targeting in-market and affinity, and there's a lot of placements that are probably a load of rubbish. There's a lot of work to try and keep them relevant and make sure there's no wastage. Whereas, StackAdapt have, and this is not a sales pitch for StackAdapt, I'm not on commission. So they have a really refined list of placements, so like really good ones like Forbes, Financial Times, and their audiences can be really tight in terms of Bombora audiences. Some, you can use an audience from someone that's downloaded a certain type of software before. So it can, we're talking about wastage. We've spoken about it quite a lot today already, but there are emerging ad platforms that do try and remove that wastage and are better for B2B.
What about the cost? What about the cost of that versus the cost of LinkedIn? The great attraction to that should be that it's way, way cheaper, right? Is it?
Huge. Yeah, it's huge. So we're talking about probably between £6 and £8 CPM. So you can get a lot of reach.
Okay, so that'll be more like 14, £15 on LinkedIn, something like that.
I think if you're running specialist, like really granular targeting, such as like targeting the financial services, you might be looking 20, 30, that much.
Very expensive.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can reach a lot of people. Whether it's as powerful as LinkedIn is another question. And also, it's a lot harder to attribute because not many people click on a display ad. They might see it and it might resonate, but actually they might not click on it. And that it's harder to view the impact of a viewed impression rather than a click impression.
Yeah, we use StackAdapt as our back end. Basically, that's how we distribute ads, and we do the targeting at the front end on various things. And then, but yeah, StackAdapt is like the DSP engine in the background.
Yeah, we also use StackAdapt, actually. Found it was pretty transformational for basically all the reasons that you said. I mean, obviously with, standard programmatic display, the wastage and low quality placements are such an issue. Whereas, the tool range available on StackAdapt is fantastic. Like they can even do ABM now, I believe. So the amount of granularity, the way you can get that reach down under the addressable universe level is really solid. I do agree though that the attribution is a bit challenging. I found that because they're using these audiences derived from sort of people's behaviors across a huge pile of data, you often end up with sort of 6 or 7 cookies per person. So the reporting will tell you that you've reached 5 million people, but it might be that you've actually reached 1 million people, each of whom had 5 cookies. So I think that getting that reach and frequency information from them, I found is quite challenging, as is like maintaining quality of the clicks that we send to site, like the retention, like actually keeping them around on site, getting them to take the actions that we want relative to platforms like LinkedIn. I found is a bit challenging, but I think that's to be expected from display on the broader internet, and hugely less expensive than LinkedIn. Really valuable platform. It's interesting that we basically all use it.
How about you, Charles? Have you ever experimented with what used to be called programmatic advertising? I think it's now just called advertising or whatever, with TalkTalk for Business.
I wouldn't say experimenting. Yes, it's a key part of our strategy. So I don't have the pleasure of using StackAdapt at the moment, but I think this comes back to the question I think Joaquin asked earlier, right? So programmatic would fall into that top of the funnel sort of activity. So there have been challenges in the past not being able to, let's say, run it as you would have liked, because if you try and do, let's say, CLV model and display is live, impressions are great, attention is great, APM is great, but then let's say a senior stakeholder asks you, okay, cool, but can you show that this has a direct impact on sales? So then that's where the difficulty comes. You can, if you're a marketer, you can explain, okay, cool, yes, I understand what you're getting at, but if you understand, econometrics, blah, 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 but then, the MD or the CEO may not want to get into that. They want to just figure out what is the most effective way to get as much sales as possible. That's where the challenge has come from. But I'm a big fan of awareness activity. I think it is really important for brand building. So we definitely do have programmatic live as part of the campaign. Just trying to make sure that is, how can I say, protected or it's understood within the wider marketing space as part of the total funnel, as opposed to only focusing on bottom funnel activity like PPC or affiliates, which may be the case what is the case for myself. I'm not sure if any others have ever experienced that kind of tussle between other departments because of that.
And what about the media multiplier effect? So how have you experienced this in your B2B marketing effort, given that we are talking about DSP, LinkedIn, and all the platforms together?
I think one thing I would say is whether you want to call it, I don't know, the halo effect or the knock-on effect, because sometimes businesses, let's say, might try and assign a factor for this, whether it's let's say, let's call it a percentage, that while we have awareness or top line activity live, we expect a 20% bolt on to total sales, because of, let's say, the lift of this other activity being running at the same time. But then how you actually measure that concurrently, that's where the difficulty comes again, with attribution and how that is quantified to a precise science. And unfortunately, I don't think that precise science actually exists, because you have, let's say, what's it called? Triple M, is that, multimedia model marketing, but then it's difficult to do, but I think it's all about trying to explain how all the different channels have a positive effect on each other when used in the right way.
Yeah, I think it goes back to sales cycles being so long, right, as well. You need to have that, rather than having 1 or 2 touch points, you need to have 9, 10, 11 touch points before a decision's even made. I think I was on a LinkedIn webinar recently, and they pitched that there was 11 to 13 touch points before someone made a decision. So having multiple channels at play just means that you can reach people multiple times, and it doesn't look spammy. It doesn't look like you're bothering someone, because every platform has a different look. Every time has a different type of kind of messaging and creative that you need to put together. For me, it goes back to how do we keep prospects engaged over that 6-8 month period, by engaging with them on multiple platforms, essentially.
Agree with everything you said there. I think we also have an extremely long sales cycle, so we do find that we require quite a lot of touch points. I think one of the unique challenges for B2B as well is the context factor. Like, it's not just about reaching people in different places, it's about reaching people in places and contexts where they're willing to think about the thing that you're promoting to them. In the case of life scientists, for example, you want to catch them when they're actually thinking about science, when they're in that more professional mind state. So for example, like LinkedIn, obviously beneficial. People are thinking in kind of a professional way when they're on LinkedIn. We also find there are plenty of platforms that provide access to scientific papers, or are themselves journals. And it turns out if you run media alongside those journals and articles, people are very responsive to that because they're already in the mindset to be thinking about their work. Whereas if we reach someone on Facebook or Instagram, it's not doomed to failure necessarily, but people might be more irritated by that touch point because it's interrupting them on their lunch break, and they probably don't want to be thinking about their job when they're scrolling Facebook. I think one really quite left field interpretation of this is in terms of catching people in the ultimate professional context. In the life sciences world, it's an industry that revolves a lot around conferencing. People go to these, key big events, at least, several times a year. And, you can get all of the digital touch points. You can buy up inventory on, professional platforms and academic platforms. But then if you then leverage that into also buying out digital billboard inventory around the actual convention center. So if we want people to visit our booth at a convention, having that halo effect between the physical media when you're walking in the door and those impressions on LinkedIn and professional platforms over the course of the previous few days, that can have a very powerful multiplier in terms of the actual footfall that we see at these events.
I think this is a good time to talk also about making sure that the touch points are relevant to the audience. So not just lumping together one audience and delivering kind of a generic message to them, segmenting your audiences into what they're interested in. So for example, we might have an audience that is interested in GRC, or we might have an audience or a job title which is interested in third-party risk management. delivering them content based on those topics rather than just a topic which, you know, might be relevant but is not an interest to them. That would change the game in terms of what one, your click-through rate, but also two, how much engagement that gets and how much, you know, less wastage you have, and how impactful that touch point is.
Yeah, you're building a connection that is way more powerful if you understand your audience, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although I think there probably is a limit. Like, it totally is possible to do one-to-one advertising with something like, you know, generative AI, but also given the context thing, like, there's definitely something to be said for being seen to be advertising to other people other than the person you're targeting, like at a conference or whatever. And if you get too niche, it's almost like can be a bit desperate and a bit like. Whereas if it's like, you know, it's like you don't want to be building a general brand like, I don't know, the Marlboro Man, because that's totally pointless, obviously. But if you could advertise yourself in a group of peers that they see as peers, and they can see you advertising to their peers as well, and they can see you interacting with their peers in a sort of one-on-one sort of way, then that's probably even more valuable than them just seeing an individual one-on-one direct message from you. Because yeah, it's a bit like peacocking, I suppose. Look how much money I have, I can advertise at this conference. But other people, social validation, I guess, as well.
Yeah. Do you mean the network effect?
Yeah, I do.
The idea that,
and I suppose what I mean is, like, in theory, you could create one-on-one emails for everyone, or you could send a newsletter that people get, and they can see it's clearly designed for people like them, and they assume, okay, this is being received by lots of people like me, and they might value that even more than something that's super targeted just to them, because then there isn't the social proof, I guess is what I was trying to say.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and also falls into what's called human behavior, that people love to form groups or clans as a form of their identity. So, you know, you don't just market to Dave who likes Manchester City, you market to Manchester City fans, and therefore you kind of tap into all the things that they like collectively. And then, you know, that's a way they can also like find a kind of collective conversation between them, and they can find solidarity between that. So you form an emotional connection in terms of what links the group, and then you tap into that as opposed to isolating one specific individual within the group.
We will run an episode about luxury and its connection with B2B marketing. I think, Tom, it will be very interesting to talk about these topics in that episode.
Yeah, because they're selling lifestyle, right? So we're getting someone from Cartier who's going to talk about how you get someone to buy not just one piece of jewelry, but like an entire suite of jewelry throughout their entire lives, like engagement, wedding, you know, every kind of wedding anniversary, and you know, they all goes to say you have to try and sell, I am a Cartier person, I think is the idea, isn't it? Yeah. Exactly.
Selling the lifestyle. That's the key. I noticed that came up I noticed that came up in a podcast a couple of weeks ago about luxury and how we can learn from that. So I was, you know, definitely look forward to listening to that.
Come along. It's on the 6th of December. You can come along as a guest if you like, Luke.
Perfect. Sounds good.
All right. Let's talk about seasonality. We are coming closer to Christmas, and it gets really expensive to advertise to a niche audience, and even more when we are in a peak season, when people are not at the office and we want to find the right people. I don't know. How do you strategize around that?
I think a really big part of this is media diversification. Auction-based platforms, obviously these sort of biddable media platforms, are, you know, very valuable. But one thing that we do often find is that while our products themselves are not particularly driven by seasonality, we are still existing in auctions that very much are. So obviously that can be kind of frustrating if you see your LinkedIn CPMs, for example, quintuple over the course of a year. You know, you can see that sort of effect, and it can be very frustrating, particularly if a lot of your media eggs are in the LinkedIn basket. So one thing I've been working with this year is diversification away from CPM-based platforms where you're extremely beholden to seasonality. And this leads you to some slightly more old-fashioned places marketing-wise, but For example, in the life sciences space, contextual targeting can be extremely powerful. I was talking about advertising against journal articles or pieces of scientific research. There's very little actual user behavioral targeting going on there. All of that is derived from the fact that if someone is reading this article, they're the kind of person we want to be talking to. And most of these platforms are willing to sell that inventory on a flat rate CPM basis, which usually shakes out as cheaper than an auction-based platform at peak times. So I found that one of the ways of working around seasonality is diversification into advertising ecosystems that don't rely heavily on auction-based approaches.
While I think that, contextual targeting can definitely be useful, depending on the industry that you're in, I think first thing I would say about seasonality is that, I don't know, maybe not necessarily work around it, but figure out whether it's actually relevant to you in the first place. Obviously, seasonality is dependent on the industry that you're in. Let's take the fitness industry. We know that, let's say at the start of January, that'll be a peak period because everyone has decided now they want to have a six-pack, and then that sort of trails down come March time and it picks up again. So they're like, if you're in the fitness industry, then you can, let's say, figure out whether your marketing can tie into behavioral seasonality and work things in that way. But then let's say, I think someone mentioned previously about, let's say, the luxury industry. Now, I'm not, let's say, well that experienced with luxury, but I have a feeling that the luxury industry is more about, let's say, the user behavior based on their sales cycle as opposed to any type of seasonality. I doubt multi-millionaires or the people out there, the really, really high purchase point, really care about whether it's January or November when they're trying to buy something. It doesn't really matter. It's more about, okay, cool, what time was I want to look at when I'm looking to buy, or whatever it is, the kind of thing that they're looking at. And then let's talk about my industry. You might think about, so obviously Black November is important for the e-commerce space. So how you want to do targeting in that area, or let's say if you have a mobile contract, when is the time that people are looking to renew or looking at, the best sort of trade deals. So I think it's all about figuring out what is the seasons that work within the industry and the kind of organization that you're working for, and then figuring out how to capitalize on that, or let's say, as I mentioned before, to figure out ways to work around it if the CPMs are going to be really high during that period because everyone else has the same approach that you do.
The really old-fashioned way of doing that was to look at a company's financial year end, because they're all different, and then work out, okay, I need to start advertising to them 9 months ahead of the financial year end because I want them to put it in their budget 3 months ahead of the year end to get it approved the month before the year end so that it's in next year's budget. But I'm not sure. I mean, in theory, you could segment your audience based on when their financial year end is, but I'm not sure whether that's useful to anyone anymore, or people just
I didn't know that, so that was a interesting piece of insight that it was based on financial year end. So thanks, learned something new.
I think where seasonality is, but while it might offer negatives in terms of increase of CPM, it also provides an opportunity. So where November might be peak for ecom, in December traditionally we see B2B decision makers wind down a little bit, and competitors might ease off. So for example, Google Ads, they might have half the budget and they might dial down on daily budgets. That actually gives you an opportunity to improve your brand voice. So while for example there might not be as much search volume around that time for high intent keywords, I don't know if it's just me, but after a couple of days around the Christmas period, I get bored and then go back into work mode. So actually, my brain's still switched on, so I might still be consuming content during the period where I have a lot more free time. Usually, I'm quite too busy to read any content, to watch a webinar. Whereas that time, I might want to upskill my knowledge or look into something that's been bothering me and reassess the last 6 months. That gives me an opportunity to have a further touch point, or maybe get to the point where we have lower cost per click, so lower CPMs, and I can maximize out that period where competitors aren't necessarily doing anything.
We have a chap at Access Group who swears by Saturday mornings as the best time to send a marketing email, because then it sits in their inbox for 2 whole days before you get the competitor's email.
I'm not sure if it's the same for B2B, because I don't think I'd be on LinkedIn on a Sunday, but I know for the ecom world, Sunday afternoon or Sunday evenings, everyone's at home, you know, dreading going back to work the next day. So everyone's always on the phone, scrolling through social media. So that's always, a good time to hit people up.
A compulsive weekend work email checker. I made the
Yeah.
terrible mistake of installing it on my phone.
Yeah.
That I'm afraid to say that would probably get through to me. I would probably get that email ahead of competitors.
Then the tone, how you are talking to them, I think it's so important, right?
Yeah, that has to be totally different if you're sending something
yeah.
on Saturday. Yeah,
Exactly.
it has to be a lot more fun and enjoyable.
Definitely, yes.
I mean, not that it should ever not be, of course.
Yeah, I agree. All right, as we wrap up, I would love to hear from each of you, if you could tell what you have learned from this conversation, whatever that you can share.
Okay, yeah, I think what I've learned is, I think two things I said for me. First of all, the importance of multi-channel advertising, which we all knew, but I say having lots of different touch points before you have the final end sale. I forget who, I remember someone mentioned they're having, let's say, a 1-year sales cycle, which I do not envy, but that can make things very, very difficult. And as the advertising industry continues to fragment with, let's say, lots of different platforms, from TV to tablets, the phone to everything else, you have to make sure to be multi-present so that you are meeting consumers where they are. And also, like, the alternative approaches that you can use, like contextual targeting, to counter things like CPM being too high in certain periods. So things about, let's say, being agile and being able to adapt and ensure that your marketing approaches are very specific to your company and to the industry that you're working in. So that's what I would say.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Charles.
For me, I think it's been generally an incredibly valuable conversation, particularly really useful to be able to talk and compare notes with someone else who A, works with StackAdapt, and B, has a very long sales period, like learning about the difference in your experience and how you go to deal with that challenge relative to me. I thought that was extremely useful. As well as the point about less specific advertising potentially being, more beneficial in some circumstances, because it doesn't come across as having that aspect of not desperation, but that sort of one-to-one-ishness. That's speaking of someone in an industry that really lives and dies on granularization. I think thinking about maybe going, the benefits of pulling that back a little bit, testing that out, that's given me some interesting ideas for things to try out.
Thank you. Luke.
Yeah, I think similarly to James, I think you stole my answer, to be honest. Yeah, so I think it's been really good to compare notes with other industries to see how similar or how different we all kind of create our strategies. Yeah, and also I always think in granularity in terms of messaging. So it's kind of, I found the newsletter point very interesting in terms of people being a part of something and maybe being a part of community, which might strike a lot more valuable than having a one-to-one email or a touch point.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. This has been a great conversation, and we will be in touch very, very soon. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for your time.
Yes.
Speak soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.